Good afternoon. Welcome to today's TASA webinar, Survey Research Methods, Interpreting and Reporting Results. Survey Research Methods is the third installment of a three-part webinar series, Statistical Tools for Attorneys in Litigation. Part 1, Introduction to Data, and Part 2, the basic tools were presented in the spring of 2012. Part 3, Survey Research Methods, is composed of 4 phases: planning and designing a survey, developing survey instruments, collecting and processing data, and interpreting and reporting results. During this program, Interpreting and Reporting Results, the presenter will cover the following: analyzing the results, interpreting statistics, and reporting the information. The presenter for today's program is Dr. Jack ReVelle. Dr. ReVelle is a consulting statistician with a PhD in Industrial Engineering and Management from Oklahoma State University. Dr. ReVelle provides his technical assistance in both quality and industrial engineering to attorneys involved in litigation. We will take 2 question and answer breaks during today's program. If you have a question, please use the chat or Q&A feature located on the right-hand side of the screen to submit your questions. We encourage all attendees to submit questions during the presentation. Tomorrow morning, I will send out a link with the archived recording of this webinar, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. I do ask that you take time to fill out the survey that will appear on your screen after today's program is over. I now invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm going to turn the program over to our distinguished guest, Dr. Jack ReVelle. Jack, the program is now all yours.
Hi, thank you very much, Matt, and I'm ready to go ahead and get started. Since I'm unable to get the webcast on my screen, could you tell me what slide number you're on?
Okay, I'm on the first one, the cover slide.
Okay, then on slide 2, folks, you'll see the background on myself. It's not a full background, but if you're interested in finding out more, you can just go to my website, www.revellesolutions.com, listed in the green area up at the top. As Matt just said, on slide 3, this is a 3-part series. We did parts 1 and 2 on the all about data and basic statistical tools much earlier in the year, and then later in the year we began part 3, survey research methods, of which this is a part. And on slide 4, we're starting part 3, and you'll see that what we covered in phase 1 was initiating a survey, planning a project, designing a sample. In phase 2, we looked at composing a question, creating item scales, and constructing questionnaires. Last time in phase 3, we talked about mail data collection, gathering interview data, and concluded with processing the data. And now today, as we begin phase 4, we'll be talking about interpreting and reporting results. This includes section 10, analyzing the results, section 11, interpreting statistics, and section 12 on reporting the information. Having said all that as prologue, let's begin now with phase 4, interpreting and reporting results, and that takes us to slide number 8. So, talking about analyzing the data. First, we'll talk about selection of the appropriate statistical tools, specifically for categorical data. We have percentage distribution tables and graphic data description tables such as pie charts, bar charts, line charts, etc. The graphic data description charts will be discussed in the sections 11 and 12 later on in this webcast. Let's take a moment and talk about percentage distribution tables, as you can see on slide number 9. On slide 9, we can see that there's 2 tables there. One is a frequency and percentage reported table, and at the top and then at the bottom, the percentage only. The 2 are very similar. You can see that the major difference is that in the table on the top, the frequency and percentage reported, there is a category at educational level refused, meaning they did not want to respond to the question, and there was 57 of those. And so what happened in the chart just below it, those 57 have been deducted from the original total leaving only 614. So you see in the first line at the table at the bottom that the capital N, which is the population size, is 614, which is 57 less than the table at the top. And that accounts for the denominator in creating the percentages over on the right. So when we talk about some high school, we see in the table at the top, there was 28. And if you included those that refused, that's 4.2%. But if you leave those out, that 28 divided by the new denominator, 614, gives you a higher percentage of 4.6%. And that's how each of the numbers in the table at the bottom of the slide were derived. In either case, both sets of percentages add to 100%. And those are the percentage distribution tables. The top one with frequency and percentage reported, and the bottom one with percentage only reported. Moving on now to slide number 10. We're talking about continuous distribution descriptions. And there are three types of measures that we want to talk about. First, measures of central tendency. These include the mean, the arithmetic average, and the median, and the mode. We'll talk about those more in just a moment. We also have measures of dispersion or spread. This can be done, determined using either maximum and minimum values, or the range of the distribution, or most commonly, the standard deviation. And finally, something that is not talked about too often, but what you should at least be aware of it, is the shape of the distribution. That includes skewness and kurtosis. And we're going to look at both of those in a little more detail in just a second. But if you want a working definition of skewness, it deals with the degree and direction of asymmetry. Asymmetry means it's not symmetrical. The normal distribution, which is a continuous distribution, is symmetrical. If you were to hold up a mirror at the center point of the normal distribution, the right side is identical to the left side is identical to the right side, and so it is a symmetrical distribution. But when you don't have a normal distribution, it becomes skewed, and this deals with the degree of the direction of the asymmetrical nature of that distribution, as opposed to kurtosis. Kurtosis, for a working definition, is an indication how peaked or flat the distribution is compared to the normal curve. Now, we're going to see examples of both skewness and kurtosis in just a minute. But first, looking at slide number 11, let's look at measures of central tendency. We just mentioned them before, the mean, median, and the mode. And you can see the three distributions on slide number 11. The mean, median, and mode are identical in a normal curve. Where you've got a frequency distribution with positive skewness, the mean, median, and mode are different, and you can see where they fall with positive skewness. Positive skewness meaning that a lot more than you would expect of the data points are falling closer to the smaller values of the distribution and fewer at the larger values of the distribution, as opposed to the curve at the bottom of the chart, which has negative skewness. With negative skewness, you've got fewer data points closer to the smaller values, and many more in larger values. And you can see that where the mean, median, and mode are located, which each of those three situations, the normal curve at the top, the positive skewness in the center, and the negative skewness at the bottom. Now let's talk about these means of normal distributions. When you've got positive skewness up in the top left on slide number 12, you've got the same thing that you saw on the previous slide, with the mode on the left side, the mean on the right side, and the median in the center. And if you have any questions about mean, median, and mode, I covered that in one of our earlier presentations. With negative skewness, once again, that's just like the distribution at the bottom of slide 11, with the mean on the left, the median in the center, and the mode on the right. You'll notice in both cases, whether you've got positive skewness or negative skewness, the median is always in the center. It's between the mean and the mode. Now, let's take a look at positive kurtosis, both with normal distributions, no skewness involved. With positive kurtosis, which is an indication of, where kurtosis is that indication of how peaked or flat the distribution is compared to a normal curve, the mean, median, and mode are dead center on each other, and you can see there's a peaked value where it looks like you're climbing up a mountain. Over in the bottom right of slide 12, we have negative kurtosis, and now you can see that a lot more of the data is occurring further away from the mean, median, and mode, resulting in a semi-flat top, and you've got a much wider distribution. If we slip over to slide number 13, you're going to see what that means in terms of percentages. Here we're still talking about kurtosis, and you can see what the spread looks like in a normal distribution. You've got 2/3 of your data, that's 64%, within plus or minus 1 standard deviation of the mean, median, and mode. 34% on one side of the mean and 34% on the other side. And then since it's symmetrical, you can see that you're then going to have another percentage, 13.5%, to the right of the 34% on the right side, and to the left of the 34% on the left side. And then the remaining 2.5% in the tail on the right side and the left side. That's the percentage of the data points that will occur within the curve. Now, by the way, think back to when you were in school and they talked about grading on the curve. This is the curve. And over on the far left, you've got your F's, followed by your D's, followed by your C's in the center. That's from plus or minus 1 standard deviation. 2/3 of your people are going to get C's. And then 13.5% will get B's, and 2.5% will get A's. But when you've got a distribution with a positive kurtosis, you notice that the percentages change as they do with the spread of the distribution with negative kurtosis. So kurtosis has a tremendous influence on the presence or the location of various data points within a frequency distribution. So when you're working with your subject matter expert statistician, be sure to make sure that you understand what kind of distribution you're dealing with, whether it's a normal distribution or whether it's skewed or whether it has some level of kurtosis, positive or negative, associated with it, because that's going to have a great deal of influence on the kind of results that you're going to be getting and the conclusions that you will be able to logically draw. Moving on to slide number 14, we're talking about the relationship between variables. Now, we talked about this in an earlier presentation. You've got dependent and independent variables. And you'll recall if you participated in that webinar that an independent variable has an influence on a dependent variable. Using weight and height as an example, height is an independent variable and your weight is dependent on it. You can't say somebody weighs so many pounds and so that person will be so tall. But you can say if a person is so tall that he or she will have a weight dependent on the height somewhere between X and Y. So we need to recall that there are independent variables and dependent variables. Then we have statistical measures of association, still on slide 14. Things called cross-tabulation, which we're going to look at in a little while, analysis of variance, discriminant analysis, and regression and correlation analysis, which we'll talk about. And then we have analysis versus interpretation. We'll cover all those as we move along. But just as a refresher, on slide 15, presented in an earlier webcast, we talked about the different types of scales and different types of data associated with them. Starting over on the far left, we have nominal data, proceeding to towards the center, ordinal data, and then interval data, and finally over on the right, ratio data. And if you were not present or did not participate in that particular webcast, I would urge you to go back to that webcast. It can be arranged with Matt, and you can hear the discussion all about the differences and the similarities between nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio data. But I bring it up here because we go on to the next slide, slide 16, and what we're talking about is tool selection for descriptive statistics. For example, you'll see on the far left-hand column, for the 4 different scale types, nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, there are different types of average selections. We talked earlier about the mean, median, and mode, and as you can see, when you're dealing with nominal data, the average tool that you would use is the mode. For ordinal data, we use the median or the mode, and for interval and ratio data, we use the mean, median, and mode, depending on what we're trying to determine. And then for the spread, we talk about there is no measure for the spread for nominal data, but we use the range of maximum and minimum for ordinal, the standard deviation range and maximum and minimum for interval, as well as for ratio. And finally, for shape, for nominal and ordinal, we do not use we do not have any tools, but we do consider skewness and kurtosis when we're dealing with interval and ratio data. Having laid that heavy trip on you, let's move on to slide number 17. Here we talk about statistical measures of association. Now, this will, if you take a quick glance at the margins, you'll see why we talked about the different types of data, nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, because whether we're talking about interval independent variables across the top or dependent variables down the left-hand side, we talk about all 4 of the different types of data. So, for example, if our independent data was nominal or ordinal, and our dependent data was the same way, then we would use cross-tabulation or chi-square analysis. If, on the other hand, our independent variable was nominal or ordinal, but our dependent variable was interval or ratio data, then we would be using analysis of variance and with the F ratio. We could also use the paired t-test and the value of t. And you can see the same thing applies for the column entitled interval or ratio data. Then we have in slide number 18, cross-tabulation print output. And at the top of the chart, you can see that we've got 2 categories, married versus not married. And down the left side, it says larks versus owls. That could be, let's say, college-educated versus not college-educated. Or it could be persons in one socioeconomic class versus another socioeconomic class. And we're able to develop the first number, as you can see in the legend, is the number of data points that we have for that one, 47 for married and larks. The row percentage is 39.2. The column percentage is 31.8. And we move across from married and not married over to the row totals, and we can sum them up, and we can see that it was a total of 120 data points for that row, and we can see what the row percentage is, which is simply the sum. And then do the same thing for the columns, and of course the whole total, 283, is the sum total of the number of persons that were involved in this particular survey. Underneath that top chart, right in the middle of the graphic, you see the chi-square value and the DF, which is degrees of freedom. And in the bottom chart, we show that we can do this not just for one value versus another, but we can do it for a range of values. For example, we do it for age, for under 35, 35 to 49, over 49. Down the left-hand side, 3 different categories. And the calculations are performed exactly the same way. All this can then be printed into some sort of bar chart or pie chart or some sort of graphic that helps the people either that are reading your report or being presented to in a courtroom situation to better understand it than just the table itself. Over on to slide number 19, we talk about the differences between group means. And we're going from the largest difference to the smallest difference from top to bottom. At the top, we see two normal distributions. And there is a large difference between the means. Almost no overlap. By overlap, we're talking about the tails or skirts of the normal distribution. You can see where that vertical straight line is between the parallel to and about halfway between the means of the two different distributions. There's virtually no overlap. They're like two completely separate distributions. As we move down, there is a substantial difference between the means, but still very little overlap. Moving down to the second from the bottom, there is a small difference between the means and substantial overlap, meaning if you've got a data point, you're not sure if it's coming from the distribution on the left or the distribution on the right. And at the bottom, almost no difference between the means and a very large overlap, meaning, did a particular data point or subject come from distribution A or distribution B? So it's important to be able to analyze those things, and your statistician will be able to help you with that. Moving on to slide number 20, we're talking about scatterplots and correlation coefficients. Correlation coefficient talks about the extent to which two variables, the independent and the dependent variables, are related. Looking at the top left, we see perfect positive correlation, meaning as the value on the horizontal scale goes up, the value, and that's the independent variable, the value on the vertical axis, the dependent variable, also goes up. And that's called perfect correlation, literally a one-for-one basis. You can have, looking to the right of that, you can have perfectly negative correlation. In that case, R, the correlation coefficient, is not 1 as it is on the left, it's -1. So that's the range for correlation coefficients, from +1 to perfect positive to -1 for perfect negative. And as we move down the page, down the slide, you say strong positive correlation where you've got a bunch of dots and you do a best fit correlation with a straight line, and you can see that the correlation is still very, very high, but certainly not 1 as it is in the distribution just above it. And the same thing applies to weak positive correlation, and virtually no correlation bottom left. You've got a scatter plot of points all over, and it looks like there's no correlation whatsoever. But if, for example, you were to have a distribution like the one over on the right, the curvilinear, where it says no correlation, maybe and maybe not. And that's something you would want to talk to your statistician about, because, for example, if you were talking about correlation between values of 0 and 50 on the horizontal axis, you have a very strong negative correlation. And between 50 and 100, you have almost a straight line. And over 100 and greater, you have a positive correlation. And so rather than just accepting the fact that it's a curvilinear, you may want to look at the values of the independent variables, because they may have some influence on your decision regarding the relationship between your independent and your dependent variables. Enough said on that. Let's move on to the next slide, number 21. And this is entitled Variance Explained by a Regression Line. Regression analysis produces a coefficient that's practically the same as the coefficient of determination for correlation analysis. It's ordinarily called R square. Some statistical programs, by the way, also compute and report the significance of R square. We'll talk about significance in a little while. With correlation analysis, the square of the coefficient indicates the proportion of variance in the two variables that is shared between them. With regression analysis, the R-square value indicates the percentage of variance in the dependent variable that's explained by the values of the independent variable, as depicted in this graphic. Thus, R-square is an indication of how much influence the independent variable has on the dependent variable. Some statistical programs also compute the significance of R-square. Now, I recognize that's a lot of information I just tossed at you very quickly, but I would urge you, if you want to find out more about that, to either contact me through Matt or go to Google and just type in some of the words, and it's explained in some great detail.
Jack, just very quickly, how would an attorney or a legal professional use regression analysis in a case?
Well, suppose you had a, let's take a look at the slide 21 that we were just looking at. Suppose we had a situation where the number of years of seniority of employees for a particular company could be related to their sick days. And what you're trying to do is determine if in fact, there is a relationship between the number of sick days taken and the years of seniority that an individual has in a company. Then what would happen is you would take and plot the data points, as you can see on this chart, and then create the regression line. It can either be eyeballed in or very easily calculated. Now the question is, does that line, even though you've drawn a line, does that line really explain what's happening? How significant is it? How much of the total variation that is recognized is explained and how much is not explained, so that you can present to the court and say, clearly, the evidence, the statistical evidence shows that the more years that an individual has with the company, the greater the likelihood they are to take their full amount of sick days as opposed to just what they need. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jack.
Okay. Well, that takes us over to the final slide for this particular section 10. So let me go through the topic summary, and then we'll take a look and see if there's any questions from the folks that are attending this particular webinar. First, we'll talk about remember the objectives. Statistics are designed to suppress detail and reveal important findings. Second, provide data description first. That is, treat individual variables for the entire sample before examining relationships. Next, always identify the scale types. The nature of the scale determines in part the proper descriptive measures. Remember we talked about ordinal and interval, ratio, etc. If you don't know what you're working with, you don't know what tools to use to analyze it. Next, treat variables both ways. Continuous items with only a few scale values can be treated as categorical. Portray information when feasible. Showing the entire distribution is more effective than just describing it. Whenever you can use a graph, use it. Describe data with care. The shape of the distribution affects the choice and interpretation of the descriptions. We were talking before about the skewness and kurtosis. The next one, determine the data type. Continuous and categorical data require different statistical measures of association. And we had a slide on that one, which measures of association to use for which kinds of data. Next, show relationships with crosstabs. The cross-tabulation tables that we looked at are more easily understood than other measures of association. Next to last, assess causality carefully. Choice of independent and dependent variables depends on their underlying meaning. The example I used earlier about height and weight, you come off as a dolt, a fool, if you will, if you start calling weight the independent variable and height the dependent variable. You might prove a point statistically, but you certainly would not make a valid impact on the court in favor of the objectives that you and your client have. Finally, select the simplest tool. The simplest method used well is far more effective than a more complex method that's used incorrectly or misunderstood. Having said all that, I'm ready to go on to Section 11 after a quick response that I may have for any questions that have come up. Matt?
Jack, thank you. During today's presentation and previous presentations, you've talked about the different types of scales and tools that can be used. In your experience, is there a type of scale or a tool that's used most often in cases that you work on?
No, not really. Is an answer I used to give when I was teaching full-time at the University of Nebraska. The students would ask me questions just like that, and my standard answer was, it depends. It depends on so many different circumstances. There's so many different things to consider. You might have two identical situations, but depending on the objective of the case, you might use ordinal for one and categorical for another.
Okay, great. And then where do you think the greatest level of confusion comes into play when dealing with all these types of variables and scales and descriptive statistics? Where do you see the most confusion when working with an attorney, a jury, a judge, all that sort of thing?
Well, the problem that's faced is just like if you were to go to a sports event, hockey or lacrosse or perhaps some sport that you've never attended or only observed once or twice, you're not familiar with the language, the vernacular, the names of certain types of particular positions or types of plays. Ignorance of commonly used phrases within a certain venue makes it almost impossible to understand. So it's the responsibility of the statistician to inform and educate the attorney that he or she is working with to provide them with the kind of information they need so that when they stand up in the court, that the court will be impressed with the attorney's knowledge as well as the presentation of materials in a way that they can understand a particular topic, no matter how complex it might seem to the layperson. If you lay the right framework and explain, as I've been trying to do in this series of webinars, explain what the basics are, and then go on and show what those mean in terms of how data that's collected can be used to prove or disprove a particular point. It makes it so much easier. If you try and jump into the topic itself before laying the groundwork, just like with anything an attorney would do in court, then you're really doing yourself and your client a disservice, and the poor members of the jury and the court really have their hands tied because they don't understand what you're saying or where you're going and what you're trying to prove, and they're going to be challenging you quietly or out loud because they're not sure where you're going with this, and you might have questions like, where are you going with this? You certainly would be challenged if nobody understood where you were going, even though you had a valid point to make.
Okay, great. Why don't we continue on with the presentation of content? I currently have slide 23 loaded onto the screen.
Okay. Let's move on from, let's see, 23. Right, okay. We're talking about descriptive statistics. Interpreting category data. We need to be concerned with interpreting distribution averages and distribution spreads and distribution shapes. Now, we've talked about that. We're talking about mean, median, and mode for the averages. For the spreads, we're talking about standard deviation, the range, minimum values. For distribution shapes, we're talking about kurtosis and skewness. Then we have floor and ceiling effects. Now, this is something I've not talked about in any of the previous webcasts. And what floor and ceiling effects makes reference to is the respondent's reaction to questions are artificially limited or bounded by the minimum and maximum scale values for a particular question. If you say, from +2 to -2, or from +5 to -5, you're artificially setting upper and lower limits. That's the boundaries, and so those become floor and ceiling effects. They can't give you if you said what value will you rate this, and the maximum value you give them is a choice of 3, and they feel so strongly about it that they want to give it a 5 or a 6, you've artificially constrained them. And the same going in the negative direction. And finally, the meaning of bimodality. Bi as in biannual, meaning 2 modes. It's possible to have a frequency distribution that has 2 modes. You might have on a scale from 1 to 10 or 1 to 20. You might have a mode at 3 and another mode at 15, depending on the responses that you're getting from the respondents. Now, you're not limited to bimodality. We can have multi-modes. We might have 3 modes or 4 modes. I've seen occasion where we've had several modes depending on how strongly people feel about particular aspects of a question that's been put to them. Now, let's move on to slide number 24, Interpreting Statistics, second slide. There's a couple of terms that you need to know about: the standard error of the estimate and the confidence interval. When we're talking about statistical inference, let me start with saying that this is population statistics are estimated from sample values. That's statistical inference. What's the standard error of the estimate? That's the standard deviation of the sample distribution. And the confidence interval is the range around the sample mean based on the standard error. Now you might say, what does all that mean? Well, we're limited to an hour of presentation on this stuff, and those things themselves, just those 2 items, could take us an hour or 2 hours to discuss in a classroom. Now let's move on to measures of association. First, statistical significance. You always hear people saying, is something statistically significant? Or what's the significance level? It means that something signifies or signals there's a good chance that 2 items are actually related to each other in the population, just as they are in the sample. The more significant it is, the more likely it is that a relationship exists. Whether you like the relationship or not, the higher the percentage, the greater the relationship. Then we have interpreting cross-tabulation. We looked at a cross-tabulation chart earlier. That's also known as a contingency table analysis. And it's used to assess relationships between 2 categorical variables. And then we have interpreting analysis of variance. This is used to measure the degree or extent and significance, there's that word again, of relationships between a categorical variable and a continuous numeric dependent variable. So you can see we're here in this very last webcast on this series that we're getting into some pretty deep stuff here. And I don't expect that any attorney, unless he or she has taken multiple courses in statistics, is going to understand 100% all of it here in this first presentation. But when you get your copy of the PowerPoint slides I'm working with, I would urge you to go to Google and type in some of these words, because there's a lot of really good stuff on the web explaining a lot of the statistical terminology and the meaning behind them. With slide number 25, the distribution for 3 respondent groups. There's 3 items to talk about here. At the top of slide number 25, we see a plot of 3 job selection score distributions. And you can see that there's government, corporation, and self-employed. And the distributions are quite different. For example, the difference between government and self-employed is much like the slide that we saw not too many minutes ago. I'm just looking back to see if I can find, so I can give you a number. slide number 19. Matt, if you can jump it over to slide 19, just for a second, just so people can see that.
Yep, I'm there. The differences between group means.
Yeah. Now that chart and the one we're looking at on 25 at the graphic at the top, you can see that we're talking about the differences between three different respondent groups. And in this case, we're talking about a small difference between the means and very little overlap, or a substantial difference between the means and very little overlap. But I just wanted to show you this, compare the real data to the theoretical presentation we made earlier. Now, in the center of slide number 25, we're talking about exactly the same data, but presented as a table. And this includes the number of persons that are involved in each category: government, corporation, and self-employed, the average or the mean, the standard deviation, which is the spread, and you notice those spreads are very, very similar, and the standard error. And remember, the standard error is the standard deviation of the sample. And then finally, the chart at the bottom of slide number 25, again, exactly the same data, but presented as a bar chart of the mean job satisfaction scores by employment type. So you can see here's three different ways to present this, virtually the same data. Moving on to slide number 26. I tossed this in for the attorney's use. This is something that you could actually even use in court if you had to. The presentation, if you're talking about statistical charts that you're going to be offering, and you want to educate the court and the jury as to the meaning of the chart you're about to present, you can use something like this anatomy of a graph to show what the graph means. And you notice it explains, starting at the very bottom, it identifies that the words in the x-axis, above the x-axis title, are the labels, various categories. And that moving up the right side, you have the plot frame. And just above that indicates what the grid lines are. And then you've got a legend up at the top. And then moving on, you've got the graph title at the top of the chart. And then you identify the plot symbols. And some of the, for example, let's call it a circle with a line through it, is value 2. And that's a plot line that's connecting each of those value 2s. And then you got value 1, which is shaded. And over on the far left-hand side, it's got tick labels. Tick is just a short name for identifying what the scale values are, 20, 25, 30, etc. And you got a place for the y-axis title. And you got major ticks, and you got minor ticks. Minor ticks are the lines in between the major ticks. So that if you were to show none of the ones on this chart, if you had, let's say, a value of 6 for the first category in the x-axis, then your gray shaded bar would move up 1 minor tick. You have a somewhat taller column. But I offer this strictly for your consideration. You may not have to use this particular chart. You may want to use your very first chart that you present in a court setting, and use that to explain what the graph's all about before going about using the data and the presentation in the chart to help make your case. But remember, the levels of education of your people sitting in the jury varies tremendously from maybe some high school to maybe some graduate work in college. And what you're trying to do is to level the playing field so that everybody is understanding what you're talking about. Some people will understand it better than others, but your job, I believe, is to make the presentation understandable to all levels, and that's why you want to explain what a chart means and what it looks like, so that when you start making your case based on a graph, that it will help you to be more persuasive in helping your client. Moving on to number 27, we're talking about continuing to talk about interpreting statistics. We want to talk about, just very briefly, interpreting versus reporting. Two items to comment on. The section we've just finished looking at is all about interpreting data. The next and final section we're going to look at is about reporting statistical findings. Let's summarize section 11 now on slide number 28. We want to begin with a data description, choose the best average, recode the data when necessary, treat data both ways. That means recode continuous variables into fewer, larger categories to use frequency tables and crosstabs, make inferences carefully, choose an appropriate level of probability for making inferences about the population and assessing statistical significance. Depend on cross-tabulation. You want to use the crosstabs to measure association between variables when feasible, rather than more complex measures of relationships. Use predictions cautiously. Be sure that equations for predictions from regression or discriminant analysis are valid and stay within the range of the database. And finally, check causality carefully. Remember that an association between variables doesn't automatically imply that one is causing the other. Now, I'm ready to go on to the last section, and I see by the clock on the wall, as they used to say in radio, you remember what radio is, it was before TV, that we don't have a lot of time left. So with your permission, Matt, can I go on to the final section 12?
Please do. I've loaded up slide number 29 for you.
And here we go. Talking about reporting the information. With report introduction, you want to talk about the executive summary, which you're going to use in court. That will be the major highlights with bulleted paragraphs versus a full report for use in discovery, including tables and graphs, with a complete narrative discussion. The response summary questionnaire, which is the original questions with the summarization of all the responses to each question. Tabular reporting with labeling, including names named and titled, and finally graphic reporting to display relationships. And on slide number 30, we're talking about reporting data descriptions, reporting multiple choice items, which is categorical data with the percentage of response choosing each category. We need to know that that's something that's very important. The next few, there's a variety of report formats. The Likert scale, that's based on Rensis Likert from the University of Michigan, and verbal frequency scale reports, which is very important. Ordinal scale reports, which we examined previously. Forced ranking scale reports, which we'll look at on the next slide in just a second. And finally, paired comparison scale reports. This type of report is typically used to compare several candidates for office or product brands. That would be in a paired comparison, A versus B. So you've got four items, A, B, C, and D. You could have A versus B, A versus C, A versus D, B versus C, B versus D, C versus D, etc. And it's a lot easier to reach a conclusion when you're using paired comparisons and ask someone to rank order 4 or 5 items. And let's move over to slide number 31, which is forced ranking scale distributions. Here we have 4 different kinds of colas and the percentage ranking each brand at each rank. For example, Coca-Cola is in the top quartile by nearly 50%, and another 44% in the second quartile, very little in the third quartile, and even less in the fourth quartile, for a sum of 100%. Pepsi-Cola, not as much as Coca-Cola in the first, but much higher in the second, much higher in the third, and much higher in the fourth. Again, 100%. The same thing is true for Royal Crown Cola and Light Cola. You're able to see literally a sliding scale. You would expect if you have a high proportion of your percentages over in the first and second quartiles, that it has to be less in the third and fourth, just to total to 100%. The Light Cola, which I've never had, is very low in the first quartile, even less in the second quartile, begins to build in the third quartile, and in the fourth quartile, 4/5, 81% of all the respondents say Light Cola is in the fourth quartile. That's a forced ranking scale distribution. On slide number 32, continuing to talk about reporting data descriptions, we have comparative scale reports and linear numeric scale reports, which I'll talk about on the next two slides. And then you can see there's a variety of other report formats, semantic differential scales, adjective checklist reports, semantic distance scale reports, fixed sum scale reports. Again, folks, check out your Google. That's what it's for. Talking about now on slide number 33, comparative scale reports, and then linear numeric scale reports on 34. Looking at slide 33, let's start out with this is what I would do if I were an attorney and I were in court. I would start out by saying, in this chart, the vertical line above, very similar, is your 0 point. It's a point of deviation for positive and negative with regard to comparison between these 6 different identifiers. The chart's oriented around a 0 point, which is the standard of comparison. And it can be shown in order of inferiority or superiority. This one is shown in order of inferiority. You can see that Drake's is minus 1.46 from the 0 line. Baker's is a little bit better at minus 0.69. Clark's minus 0.34. And then suddenly we go positive, and the most positive one, deviating from the 0 point, is Everett's at 0.34. That's a great way to show comparison in terms of how well or how poorly something is doing. Over on slide 34, we have a linear numeric scale plot. This particular item, it says the mean ratings of important. Well, mean, which one is it? Are you using the average, the median, or the mode? It doesn't say. But here we have a variety of different topics down the left-hand side. At the bottom, it says 325 responses, spreading it from 1, not important, all the way up to 5, very important. And you can see that this is going from the lowest value on the left to the highest value on the right. So there's these 325 respondents indicated that quality of merchandise was most important, followed by a variety of products, etc. And the blocks are meant to be greater or lesser in width, and the narrower block indicates greater agreement. That is to say that it's got less variation from the high to the low value. Now let's move over to the next slide, slide number 35. And this is measures of association, which is to show relationships between variables. There's a variety of different reports. The cross-tabulation report we've already talked about, and there's a number of other reports, formats and graphics. The ANOVA report, which is analysis of variance reports, the paired t-test reports, correlation analysis reports, regression analysis reports, and finally, we want to, in putting together putting the project to bed, we want to conclude it by including authorship and contact information. The SME, subject matter expert statistician, and the attorney work together to finalize and edit the project and report for presentation and distribution. So, the last slide on section 12 is summary. First, spend the time and effort. Avoid the temptation to rush through the report and do it carefully, even though sponsors may be overly anxious. Keep it very neat. The appearance and cosmetic aspects of the report often indicate to readers, rightly or wrongly, the credibility of the survey results. Use an executive summary. Pragmatic survey research reports should begin with a quick summary of the main highlights and major results. You get into the details thereafter. Include a response summary. Prepare a blank questionnaire listing the simplest form of data description, removing the superfluous codes or instructions, so that the people that are studying the report can see what the questions to the respondents were. Compose your tables first. Condense the information with clean, simple formulas in a single page so patterns and relationships can readily be perceived. Display the information. Create charts, graphs, and diagrams when values and relationships can be represented more clearly by size and shape than by words and numbers. Write a simple narrative. Avoid jargon, and God, that's important for everybody. not just statisticians and attorneys. Avoid jargon and use plain vocabulary to describe the major findings revealed in each table, with introductions and summaries of each section. Keep components independent. Tables and graphs should be clearly labeled and the narrative written so report readers can obtain the major gist of the results from either mode. And finally, conclude the project. Edit, copy, and bind the reports. Include a title page for identification and maintain data and documents until directed to deliver or destroy them. Now, probably nobody in the world does that better than attorneys. In working with attorneys, I know how detailed you folks are in doing this sort of thing. Well, we've got just 4 more slides to go and about 4 minutes to go, so here I go. On slide number 37, on section number 10, let your subject matter expert statistician analyze the resulting data. In section number 11, let your SME statistician interpret the resulting data. And finally, in section 12, which we just completed, the attorney and the subject matter expert statistician team up to report the results to the client as well as for the court and the jury. Now, 3 slides on summary of the entire 4-part discussion of statistical tools for attorneys in litigation. On slide 38, this TASA webinar introduced the 4 major parts of survey research methods. Part 1, planning and designing the survey. Part 2, developing survey instruments. Part 3, collecting and processing data. And Part 4, interpreting and reporting results. When the time comes for you to select and retain a TASA statistical expert, be prepared to see and hear terms that can be unfamiliar to you. Slide 39. As an attorney, your clients don't expect you to perform each of the necessary steps associated with experimental design and data collection, but you must be prepared to both comprehend and confidently explain the work submitted to you by your TASA expert statistician. And finally, on slide 40, without this understanding, your courtroom presentations relative to the research methods and resulting statistics will lack the confidence necessary to convince judges and juries that you represent the truth. On behalf of your present and future clients, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for participating in this series of statistically oriented webinars. And with that, back to our host, Matt Hyde.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jack. Thank you for the time and the effort that you've put into not only this webinar, but all the previous webinars. And as you mentioned many times during your presentation, all of the previous webinars can be found on our website, tasanet.com. I'll go over that during the conclusion. I don't see any questions in the queue. Jack, would you like to make any other concluding remarks before I wrap things up here?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. I hope that as many of you have had opportunity to deal with statisticians, think that what you've learned in this series is valuable and you're going to be able to put it to use. If I can be of any assistance, please don't hesitate, contact Matt, and he in turn will contact me. And if you want to find out more about me, check out my website, as I mentioned earlier, www.revellesolutions.com. I thank you all very much for participating, and I wish you good luck in your travails, and I wish good luck to Notre Dame in the BCS championship game in just a few weeks. Go big, go Irish.
Well, thank you, Jack. For those in attendance, I am a 2003 graduate of Notre Dame, and I'm very happy to have the Fighting Irish in the national championship game. If you'd like to speak to Jack about a specific case or project that you're working on, please contact us here at TASA. Our telephone number is 800-523-2319. As I mentioned during the introduction, tomorrow morning we'll send out an email that will contain a link to the archive recording of this program, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. I'll also include links to all of Jack's previous programs. Our next webinar for legal professionals, Cost-Effective Strategies for E-Discovery, will take place on December 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You should be receiving an invitation for that program shortly. If you have any follow-up questions or comments, we do take all of your comments under consideration. They do help us to produce better programs. Please send me an email at mhyde@tasanet.com. With that, I will end today's program, and I look forward to seeing you at future TASA events.